Hello, welcome to another edition of Know the Bible, plain and simple story number 13 today. The story about David. David is one of the key figures in the Old Testament, and a lot of stories go with him. So we're going to race through a bunch of his stories today. If you haven't done so, you might want to read 2 Samuel chapter 11. You could read the whole book of 2 Samuel and even some of the last part of 1 Samuel to get the whole story of David. When we think about David, um, we think about a king who is often called righteous, and yet even in his righteousness was not perfect. But we'll hear more about that in the details. What do you need to know when it comes to David? One, while Saul is king, remember Samuel was the judge, then people asked for a king. God gave him Saul. Saul wasn't all that great. And God decided to raise up a king that was after God's own heart. And so he went to Jesse, who had several sons, and Samuel was going to anoint one of them to be the next king. Lo and behold, after he goes to all the sons, God's like, yeah, it's none of these. He asks David. He asks Jesse, do you have any others? And Jesse says, yeah, one more. He's the youngest. He's out tending the sheep, little shepherd boy. And Samuel says, bring him. And sure enough, that's the one that God decides is the one to be anointed to become the next king. Still young, he gets involved in King Saul's battles against the Philistines. One of the Philistines' name is Goliath, huge man with huge spear, and intimidated everyone. Kind of said, if you can beat me, then we'll give up. If you can't, if I beat you, then we'll take over you guys. And so no one wanted to fight Goliath. David comes by, just check on his family, bring some supplies to his brothers who are in the army, sees the taunting of Goliath, and because of his trust in God and knowing that God is more powerful than a world of Goliaths, is willing to fight Goliath. And so David goes after Goliath with not a sword or a shield or a spear, but a couple stones from the water and a slingshot, and conquers Goliath with a stone to the head, and then cuts off his head and keeps a sword for himself. And then the Israelites rout the Philistines that day. After that, David gets called into Saul's court for battle at times, but also as a musician. And we realize that David is a very prolific musician. Not only plays, but also writes music and writes lyrics, and indeed is the author of more psalms in the Bible than anyone else. And those psalms are kind of the hymn book of the children of Israel and get used for generations and to this day as well. Nonetheless, as David's success continues to grow, especially out on the battlefield, Saul gets jealous. He kind of recognizes that David is going to be the next king instead of his own son Jonathan. He gets upset. He threatens his life. David runs away, and now Saul pursues him from place to place. A couple times Saul gets close, and Saul gets delivered into David's hand, really. One time Saul was relieving himself in a cave. And each time David, even though he has a chance to kill King Saul, refuses to do so, honoring the person whom God placed as the first king. And indeed, he waits until King Saul loses his life, along with Jonathan, in battle against the Philistines. And after that, he is made king of Judah, just of the one tribe for a while, as the rest of Israel tries to figure itself out. But eventually the rest of Israel comes to David as well and asks him to be king of the whole nation. And he really unifies the whole nation and brings it into a new age and a new dynasty, because it's this dynasty of David which will really, in many ways, last forever. David, then being king, conquers Jerusalem, which is a city that had not been conquered yet, up on a hill. And it is in Jerusalem that he makes the place for his throne. Also brings the ark, and he has a plan to build a temple there for the Lord. But the Lord says, not you, David, too much blood on your hands. A son of yours will build the temple, but for you, I'm building your house. And that's just kind of the way the grace of God works. As much as we want to do stuff for him, he's already ready to do stuff for us. Uh, David's success is good for a long time, and then he gets himself into trouble. While his army goes off to fight a battle where he should have been as well, he stays home, and that's where he begins to lust after one of his neighbors, you might say, looking down from his palace, Bathsheba, and indeed he brings her into his home, and then after having an affair of sorts, I guess, with her, he brings her husband home from battle, Uriah, tries to get Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba because she's now pregnant with David's child, to make it look like it's Uriah's child. Uriah is just and like, I'm not going to go with my wife. All my mates are out in the battlefield. I'll sleep outside if I need to. I'm ready to go back to war. David lines it up so that when Uriah gets sent back, he's put in a place in battle and a place where he is most open to being killed, and indeed he is. And so David has multiplied his adultery into also murder, and we see the cracks in his armor. We see even the most righteous of kings is unrighteous. Out of this, by the way, comes one of his beautiful psalms, "Created me a clean heart, O God, renew a right spirit within me," as he is faced by the prophet Nathan with the sins that he has committed. Repenting, crying out to the Lord, ultimately the Lord forgives him, though Bathsheba and he do get married, and then the child that they conceived out of wedlock does end up dying. Nonetheless, things aren't as smooth now for the kingship of David. His son Absalom tries to overthrow Father David and take over the kingdom for himself. David has to run away for a while, ends up fighting his son. He hates that. Wants his son protected, but his son gets his hair caught in a tree and is hanging there. And David's military commanders see him, and they put him to death. Breaks David's heart, but saves the kingdom. And eventually David grows older and older, and the son that then replaces David on the throne, which David chooses before he dies, is Solomon. And Solomon's mother is Bathsheba. We'll pick up Solomon next time, when there's so much imagery between David and Jesus. Jesus is in many ways the perfect David, or David is the imperfect Jesus, you might say. David wrote, "The Lord," Psalm 23, "the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want." Even though he is king, he knows that the Lord is the one whom he answers to. He knows that the true king is God himself. And yet out of David's seed will come the King of Kings, Jesus Christ, the good shepherd who shepherds his sheep, not just for Judah or Israel, but indeed ends up being king of all of creation. We'll get to that a little bit later. In terms of what next, share what stands out with your household. Share your favorite story. What's your favorite David story? There's so many of them. And take some time to pray with and for one another, and close with the Lord's Prayer. And again, next time we'll pick up with David and Bathsheba's son, King Solomon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.